The 90s were a tumultuous time at Marvel. At the beginning of the decade, many of their top titles experienced unprecedented sales in the midst of a speculator market. But as the years wore on, the bottom on the market fell out, and Marvel felt the effects of their constant cycle of reinvention. This alienated many readers from the same properties that they had once been attached to. Such is the case for Luke Cage and Iron Fist, the heroes for hire. As street-level heroes with a niche audience, Marvel made frequent attempts throughout the 90s to reinvent the characters, hoping to turn them into mainstream stars. In reality, though, a number of poor decisions further distanced those characters from the existing fan base. Failed ongoing titles, gritty backup features, and confusing miniseries seemed to be the best that fans could look forward to. Amidst this chaos, John Ostrander and Pasqual Ferry's Heroes for Hire relaunch serves as a beacon of quality that encapsulates the best aspects of the decade's creative output. It was an exciting series and a unique home for fan-favorite characters who would go on to become major players in the Marvel Universe. However, over 20 years after the book's cancellation, it is best remembered as a great could have been, or almost was. So, what happened? How did two of the most dynamic stars of the 70s and 80s become two of the most underutilized, neglected, and irrelevant of the 90s? Like many Marvel hits, the formula behind the success of the original Heroes for Hire came together through a series of trial and error. In 1978, Luke Cage, Hero for Hire, or as he was then known, Power Man, was struggling to keep sales afloat for his own title. At the same time, Danny Rand, the immortal Iron Fist, had been featured prominently in the pages of Marvel Premiere, and eventually got his own series, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be able to sustain itself. Both characters had proven to be popular during the Bronze Age of comics as personifications of the blaxploitation and kung fu film genres, but as those genres began to wane in popularity, sales began to slip. In an effort to refresh the duo, Marvel decided to pair them together as the now plural Heroes for Hire. As luck would have it, it worked. The book was a hit, and Power Man and Iron Fist became a fan favorite series. With their combined star power, plus the additions of Colleen Wing and Misty Knight to the book, the series rose in popularity. Marvel increased the shipping schedule, and the characters started appearing in more books such as X-Men, Daredevil, and a fairly regular stretch in Marvel Team Up. But as time went on, frequent creative team changes left the title feeling somewhat stagnant. Enough so that Marvel decided to abruptly end the partnership of the Heroes for Hire as well as the title in 1986. In the final issue, Iron Fist was brutally murdered by a young boy named Bobby Wright, the alias of Captain Hero. Luke Cage was framed for his murder. It was a harsh conclusion for a beloved partnership. But the story didn't end there. Following the conclusion of Power Man and Iron Fist, neither Luke nor Danny would have any substantial appearance for over 5 years. In that time, Marvel had seemingly abandoned the plot thread of Iron Fist's murder entirely. In a surprising move, it was writer-artist John Byrne who saw an opportunity to bring back an old friend in the pages of Namor. See, John Byrne had gotten his start at Marvel through drawing the Iron Fist series, and perhaps seeing the hero languish in the gutters brought out the best in his creative spirit. In any event, Byrne decided to bring back Iron Fist in a way only possible through the world of comics. Now this is gonna get weird, I'm just telling you now. Byrne's Namor series revealed that Iron Fist had never actually been murdered. See, Danny was suddenly alive and back as the head of his family company, Rand Meacham. When his confused former allies Colleen Wing and Misty Knight went to go confront him, he blew off the duo, which immediately raised their suspicions. It wasn't long until Rand Meacham found itself in the crosshairs of Namor, and in the ensuing conflict, the book revealed that this Danny was actually the shape-shifting Super-Skrull in disguise. After this, Colleen and Misty joined up with Namor to go visit Iron Fist's grave. But when they got there, they found out that his body had decomposed into a pile of leaves. See, years earlier when the Heroes for Hire had gone on an adventure to Iron Fist's adopted home of Kunlun, Danny had been attacked and replaced with a plant person duplicate known as a Hilthri. So that was the Iron Fist who got murdered by Captain Hero, not the real deal. Now, to make things even weirder, it had been revealed elsewhere that Captain Hero was actually a mind-controlled Super Skrull. So this meant that it had been a mind-controlled Super Skrull who had killed Iron Fist. Only that wasn't actually Iron Fist, that was a plant person Hilthri Iron Fist. And then the Super Skrull pretended to be Iron Fist, only for that to be the thing that led to the return of the real Iron Fist. Are you still with me? In any event, Namor and Colleen and Misty teamed up, they found the real Iron Fist, and they brought him back into the proper Marvel universe, and all was right with the world. Only didn't quite pan out that way, at least not right away. See, as Iron Fist was brought back to the land of the living, Luke Cage was getting prepped for a renewed solo push. He was given a new book, now simply titled Cage, and a lead-in storyline in the pages of The Punisher. But the problem is that Punisher's story was mired in controversy as it saw Frank Castle undergo blackface, albeit involuntarily, to try to escape a hit on his life. It was a very controversial story and an infamous moment in the histories of both characters. The storyline was co-written by Cage series writer Marcus McLaren, and it set the stage for what was to come. Right from the beginning, it was clear that things weren't quite clicking in Cage, as Luke was stripped of most of his familiar character traits and supporting cast in favor of a new status quo in Chicago. He also didn't know that Danny was alive, so he was still really angry at the world. But a year into the series, McLaren and company decided to reunite the Heroes for Hire 7 years after they had been torn apart. And how was this delivered to fans who had yearned for this moment? In a splash page with an emotional embrace? In a manly handshake a la Predator? Nope! With a cluttered 7-panel page that saw Luke punch Danny because he doesn't need his help. Look, I'm trying not to editorialize the timeline too much because I'll get to that later, but this moment was a massive letdown for fans of both characters. And it wasn't long until Cage was canceled, due to struggling sales. Following this, Luke and Danny made various guest appearances across the Marvel universe, but repeated attempts at pushing the two as solo stars dwindled down their remaining fan base. It just wasn't what people wanted to see. If Marvel was going to have any chance of saving the two, the only solution was going to be to bring them back together. So that's exactly what they did, and they started making more guest appearances together across the Marvel universe, setting the stage for what was to come next. By 1996, Luke Cage and Iron Fist weren't the only heroes suffering. Marvel's success earlier in the decade had created unfair expectations for what the market could sustain. Years of promoting sensational fresh starts and collector's issues had burned out many readers. Additionally, changes to editorial teams led to constantly shifting priorities, all in an effort to reach the heights of Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man, or Chris Claremont and Jim Lee's X-Men, or Rob Liefeld's X-Force, or any number of the hits they had at the beginning of the decade. Seeking to streamline the continuity in many of their books to make them more accessible and marketable to a wide audience, Marvel used the company-wide crossover storyline event Onslaught to relaunch Avengers, Iron Man, Fantastic Four, and Captain America under the stewardship of some of their esteemed alumni, including the aforementioned Lee and Liefeld. In order to do this, Franklin Richards, son of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman, used his reality-altering powers to create a counter-Earth for those characters to live on, taking them out of the main Marvel continuity. Now, removing these characters created a unique opportunity for the remaining books, allowing for a lot of new ideas. Kurt Busiek and Mark Bagley's Thunderbolt series was one of those ideas, and it took off and was a huge hit. Hot on the heels of Thunderbolts, Marvel decided to bring back an old fan favorite. Well, kind of. Roger Stern was brought in to reinvent Luke and Danny in the pages of Power Corps, a new ongoing series. Stern had been a veteran of Marvel and was responsible for much of Spider-Man's success throughout the 80s, including co-creating Hobgoblin, as well as writing many Merry Marvel monthlies, including Captain America, Incredible Hulk, and a nearly 10-year-long run on the Avengers. Power Corps represented Stern's return to Marvel after many years away, but it was not meant to be. Though he would come up with the cast and the central pitch for the series, Stern's commitment to DC's Superman titles as well as Legionnaires prevented him from taking on the gig. Instead, Stern recommended writer John Ostrander to editor Mark Bernardo. Ostrander had been working on Punisher and was known primarily for his work at DC Comics, where he had been the one to successfully reinvent the Suicide Squad. For that, he took the loose framework of a classic property and reinvented it for a modern audience, achieving success beyond anything the original ever obtained. He seemed like a natural fit to do the same thing for the now retitled Heroes for Hire. Joining him was artist Pasqual Ferry, whose art had been a highlight of the final days of Marvel's 2099 line of books, and was coming off of a number of fun fill-in issues for popular titles such as X-Men. His art was really vibrant and kinetic, and had more in common with the original Power Man and Iron Fist series than it did something like Cage. Additionally, Ferry had familiarity juggling multiple characters with unique designs in a team book. It's a tough skill to master, and an essential one for a book like Heroes for Hire, which features an eclectic cast of characters. Together, Ostrander and Ferry offered familiarity for long-term fans, as well as a fresh artistic flair that would anchor the book in that era. In May of 1997, Heroes for Hire returned, over 10 years after the cancellation of their previous series. Now, where that original book had focused on the exploits of Iron Fist and Luke Cage, the new title would see the team expand their ranks to increase their power and hopefully increase sales. The original Human Torch, Jim Hammond, as well as Black Knight, Hercules, and a mysterious new White Tiger were welcome additions to the series. Additionally, the Hulk teamed up with the group for the first issue as they dealt with the chaos caused by a breakout at the Vault, a massive super prison. From the beginning, Ostrander and Ferry worked towards a larger narrative as the mysterious master of the world tried to manipulate events towards his own goal of global domination and extermination. In an interesting twist, Luke secretly worked alongside the master to achieve his own goals as well. For months, the Master manipulated the Heroes for Hire as they fought against the likes of the UFOs, the Deviants, the Punisher, Nitro, and even the Thunderbolts, while new members joined the team such as She-Hulk, Athena of the Eternals, and Ant-Man. Then, after a year of build-up, Luke finally betrayed the team and he joined up with the Master. In order to save the planet, Luke stood side by side with the man who seemed determined to control it. Fortunately, it was all a ruse, and Luke betrayed the Master, proving instrumental in defeating him once and for all. Shortly afterwards, the Heroes for Hire began a team-up storyline with Quicksilver, also written by John Ostrander. Now, both of these titles had been developing their own threads involving the High Evolutionary and Wundagore, as well as Exodus and his acolytes. In the 5-part Siege of Wundagore storyline, the villainous Man-Beast teamed up with Exodus to take on the combined might of Quicksilver and the Heroes for Hire. It was a wild sci-fi storyline involving genetic engineering, secret cities, and the lives of everybody on planet Earth. But at the end of the day, good triumphed over evil. Unfortunately, there was great loss in their victory. This storyline was originally supposed to lift sales on both titles, but in reality, it signaled the end. Quicksilver was cancelled just 1 month later, and Heroes for Hire shortly after that. The first issue of Heroes for Hire sold just over 50,000 units in May 1997. It was the 39th highest selling comic of the month and the 28th when you adjust for the revenue earned due to the inflated $2.99 price tag. It was also the highest non-X-Men, non-Spider-Man, non-Heroes Reborn title that Marvel had that month, aside from all the flashback-themed one-shots going on. It's fairly common for books to lose sales every month, as more readers tend to leave a series than new readers jumping on board. Still, Heroes for Hire managed to retain a shocking 62% after its first year. For comparison, Quicksilver, which ran at the same time, debuted at 57,000 units and ended up only holding on to 39% of its readership by the time it reached issue 12, right before its cancellation. During this same period, Thunderbolts was selling anywhere between 40,000 and 50,000 units every month. but I couldn't find exact numbers for the first couple of issues, so I can't tell you how much it retained from that initial launch. Interestingly, the Avengers series that debuted in 1997 to signal the return of the Avengers to the proper Marvel continuity and the end of Heroes Reborn sold roughly 194,000 units for its first issue, but retained only 51% by the time issue number 12 rolled around, the same month that Heroes for Hire ended. So what does that tell us? Well, Heroes for Hire was never a huge seller, but that much was obvious when the series was green-lit. The hope was that it would have a strong debut and hold onto a high percentage of those readers. But when you consider how many other high-profile comics were going on at the same time, it entered a very crowded market. In the months before it came out, Marvel heavily promoted Thunderbolts as a new must-read series. Those characters were given substantial guest appearances and cover appearances in other books, such as Incredible Hulk, Spider-Man Team-Up, and yes, even Heroes for Hire. Heroes for Hire did not get the same assist. They did not appear on any other book's cover, and the only guest appearance of note that they had was in Fantastic Four a year into the Heroes for Hire series. While it's definitely worth saying that Thunderbolts needed a lot of promotion because it was a brand new property, I think it can just as easily be argued that Heroes for Hire needed it too, since it had been more than 10 years since Luke and Danny had headlined their own series. John Ostrander wrote all 20 issues of Heroes for Hire. Of those, Pasqual Ferry drew 16 issues with Jaime Mendoza on inks. Martin Eglin, Scott Collins, and Mary Mitchell provided pencils for the fill-in issues, with Hector Collazo, Dan Panosian, and Keith Aiken on inks. Joe Rosas provided the colors for the series, and John Babcock did all the lettering. For his part, Roger Stern was giving a plotting credit in the first issue, with additional special thanks given to Joe Edkin, who would co-write much of the Quicksilver series with Ostrander. James Felder, who wrote the previous Iron Fist miniseries, edited the first issue alongside Mark Bernardo, who would go on to stay for the entire length of the run. It's often difficult for a book to maintain a consistent creative vision beyond its initial arc, especially from the art team. But in the case of Heroes for Hire, Mendoza and Ferry deliver incredible work, and they manage to keep pace with the series. They do 13 regular-sized and 3 double-sized issues, and if they were all regular issues, I have no doubt they would have been able to do the entire series. This consistency from the entire creative team is one of the main reasons why over 20 years later, the book holds up so well. Unfortunately, sometimes consistency isn't enough to keep sales afloat. Even though Heroes for Hire retained readership remarkably well, even better than a marquee series like Avengers, it never had as many readers to begin with, so every lost sale mattered all the more. Marvel was in a period of financial recovery at this time, having just filed for bankruptcy in December of 1996. Having too many books on the market had unfortunately been part of Marvel's downfall. So whether or not they knew where the Heroes for Hire were going to go after the end of their series, it did make sense to cancel it. They had to make short-term sacrifices in order to ensure the long-term stability of the company. Luke Cage began the 90s wanted for murder and forced into the most obscure reaches of the Marvel Universe. Readers were robbed of seeing a period of emotional doubt and reflection play out in front of their eyes, and instead it was just used for a couple of lines of dialogue in an issue of Marvel Comics Presents. The Punisher lead-in story for Cage is at best problematic, and at worst, it represents the lowest point in Luke Cage's history. Off the back of that, the Cage ongoing series had many shortcomings, but more than anything else, it feels like that book was trying to exploit and capitalize on early 90s black cultural movements without really taking the time to explore these ideas. The book addressed concepts that paralleled the beating of Rodney King, wrongful imprisonment, and the musical themes of NWA. But because it was a comic book of the early 90s, it was also trapped in the gritty extremism of the era. Every issue had a certain number of fight scenes it needed to meet. There was an obsession with state-of-the-art military weaponry, and for some reason the villains got so much focus that they practically became co-leads. Luke lashed out at the world around him because the constant action didn't leave room for much else. The original Power Man and Iron Fist series was plagued with editorial attempts to make Luke into an angrier character, and I don't think it's out of line to say that they got their way with Cage. Luke's persistent inability to emotionally connect with those around him prevented that book from having an engaging supporting cast, and in my opinion, it didn't make for a rewarding read. Luke felt like a stereotype again, albeit a dramatically different one than he had been years prior. Now, there is an important conversation to be had about Luke Cage's development from a blaxploitation caricature to a nuanced hero, but there isn't time for that here. I'd be talking for hours. What I will say is that the Power Man of old had heart and a genuine connection with his community, but the fish out of water element of Cage that came as a consequence of moving him to Chicago created a disconnect between him and his supporting cast, and a disconnect between him and the readers. This was especially clear when Danny and him were reunited. It was a moment fans had clamored for, and they showed a clear mishandling of the characters when Luke's first reaction was to punch Danny. Danny was his partner, and this reunion should have been a moment of emotional vindication, both for the characters and for the readers who had waited so long to see them brought back together. Power Man and Iron Fist have a unique brotherhood in comics and a respect for one another that few others can claim to have. So this moment, it was really the opposite of what everybody wanted to see. It was messy, it was shock for the sake of shock. McLaurin's Cage series has some interesting socio-political undertones to it, but ultimately it fails to understand why readers had gravitated towards Luke in the first place. The John Ostrander Heroes for Hire series addressed these issues and Luke's feelings of anger by adding nuance to them, allowing them to play out in the background of the book for the first year. Luke's alliance with the Master was key to this. After being mistreated by society for so long, it seemed believable that he would want retribution after being framed for murder multiple times and losing so much. By leading readers to believe that Luke had given into his anger only to reveal that he refused to let it control his actions, Ostrander's handling of Cage allowed the character to turn a corner in his emotional development that rewarded readers for their investment. Luke also had lots of interpersonal conflicts with the other members of the team, and he was plagued with doubts. All of these factors allowed for readers to buy into his story. It's a common technique, but it's part of why characters like Hawkeye, the Human Torch, and Gambit have proven to be so popular over the years, because readers can find a piece of themselves in these characters and their emotional journeys. It rewards you for reading the series, and it rewards you for caring. Luke hadn't been given this level of nuance in years, and Ostrander's work allowed the character to grow and made it easier for other writers to use him down the line. Heroes for Hire represents a younger and an angrier Luke Cage than you might expect if you were to pick up one of his appearances today. But the work that Ostrander put in helped move Luke past the stereotypes that had been thrust upon him years prior. Without Heroes for Hire, it's difficult to know if the character would have still gone in the same direction he has. For Iron Fist, the 90s began with some of the most bombastic stories that the character would ever endure. But the retcon surrounding Danny's death was welcomed by fans who were never really happy with the way that he had been taken off the board to begin with. John Byrne's Namor series was ridiculous and it was over the top, but there was a charm to it, and all of the bizarre plot threads that happened to Danny throughout that series were resolved by the time it was done, so other writers were able to use him freely after that. Once his time in Namor was over, Danny migrated over to a regular feature in Marvel Comics Presents, where he teamed up with Ghost Rider. But since that was an anthology series, each issue only gave them 8 pages of story, and sharing those pages meant that Danny didn't really have a lot of time for individual focus. Even when Danny eventually did get his own miniseries, it was only 2 issues long, so it didn't really have a lot of room for character progression. All it really was an update on whatever was going on with Kun-Lun at the time, so Iron Fist didn't really benefit that much from having it. Writer-editors Joey Cavalieri and James Felder leaned into style over substance for these stories, utilizing a lot of outdated kung fu tropes that were problematic. This was probably to compensate for the shorter nature of these stories, but as a direct result, Iron Fist was robbed of having his own unique voice. This caused a lot of damage for Danny, who felt like a stand-in for Jean-Claude Van Damme or any other white savior kung fu archetype that was popular at the time. By the time he got his hands on him, John Ostrander was left with the shell of a character. Ostrander's solution to this was to thrust Danny into the spotlight as the leader of the Heroes for Hire. In addition, Iron Fist had his own B-plots that developed in the background of the series, further fleshing out his motivation. Iron Fist feared for the safety of those around him, but at the same time he was building up his own power structure to protect the world from an even greater threat lurking in the shadows. The cliche kung fu storylines were left in the past, and Iron Fist was able to move forward as a character for the first time since the 70s. At the same time, Ostrander added emphasis to Danny's connections with the world around him. Instead of just existing to support other heroes, he now had people that were there for him too, including Luke, Misty Knight, and Jim Hammond. As leader, he also had unique dynamics with every member of the Heroes for Hire, which added more layers to his voice and helped further flesh out the man behind the mask. This made Iron Fist feel like an important part of the Marvel Universe again, which was very important for what happened next. As the 90s drew to a close, the Heroes for Hire seemed to vanish once again. With no book to call their own, the characters were split up and left to sporadic appearances in other titles. However, changes behind the scenes would create the opportunity for their best days yet. In September of 1998, as Heroes for Hire was on its last legs, the Marvel Knights imprint began. The imprint was a home for many characters who needed a fresh direction, and it provided fans with a new take on old favorites. The book sold very well, and nearly unanimously the line was met with critical praise. Marvel wisely took their time with the imprint too, slowly adding books instead of overwhelming the market like they had in the past. It wasn't long until Luke Cage and Iron Fist were brought into the imprint as supporting cast members in Daredevil by writer Brian Michael Bendis. Bendis' approach was similar to Ostrander's in that it focused off of their connections to the greater Marvel Universe. With their profiles rising once more, Iron Fist was given a mini-series with Wolverine, and Luke Cage became a supporting cast member in Alias, another Brian Michael Bendis book. And then, the impossible happened. In 2004, Marvel relaunched The Avengers. Using the storyline Avengers Disassembled as a catalyst, writer Brian Michael Bendis and artist David Finch killed off many of Earth's mightiest heroes, including beloved members Hawkeye, Vision, and Heroes for Hire alum Ant-Man. In the aftermath, a new team was brought together to respond to a breakout at the Raft, another super prison. These events echoed Ostrander and Ferry's Heroes for Hire book years prior. Luke Cage was caught in the middle of the conflict, and as the dust began to settle, he became a charter member of the new Avengers. Iron Fist would join the book shortly after, and the two of them would become crucial to the central focus of the series. New Avengers was a sales juggernaut, and the lasting appeal of that series elevated the characters to new heights. Years after the Heroes for Hire were given new life in the absence of the Avengers, it was only appropriate that the return of Marvel's premier superhero team would signal a new life for two of Marvel's greatest characters. In the years that have followed, the Heroes for Hire have gone on to headline countless miniseries, ongoing series, and even have Netflix adaptations. But those are the subject for another day. The 90s represented the best and worst of times for Marvel. For Luke Cage and Iron Fist, Heroes for Hire, the decade represented a seismic shift as they transitioned from their Bronze Age incarnations into the heroes we know and love today. Over the course of a decade, they grew from 90s grit into boldly triumphing in the pages of their own ongoing series, over time becoming refined and primed for their greatest days to come. While they may have been let down by poor sales, creative shifts, and uneven storytelling, the lasting appeal of the Heroes for Hire persevered through the 90s on to the new millennium. The hard work of John Ostrander, Pasqual Ferry, and countless others built a strong foundation for their best days yet to come. And now, over 20 years later, the Heroes for Hire are household names adored around the world. Sweet Christmas. So that's it. Are you a fan of Luke Cage, Iron Fist, and the Heroes for Hire? What are some of your favorite stories with the characters? Be sure to let me know in the comments section. Thank you so much to Comichron, Back Issue Magazine, and a lot of Marvel Comics for making this video possible. And thank you so much for checking it out. This is my first foray into the world, and it is wonderful and terrifying, and I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it, please subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be making some really exciting new stuff, hopefully quite soon. You can also find me across social media at A White Cuban. I'd love to hear from you. Please let me know what you liked, you didn't like, and what you would like to see in the future, and I'll be making more exciting videos very soon. Oh my god, my eyes are tearing, and I'm happy.